Across most states in the U.S., new voting laws are being drafted by Republican lawmakers.
Voting rights are being attacked in more than 40 states across the country.
These laws are both a response to the voting options the pandemic emergency created, and also the heated rhetoric surrounding Donald Trump's election loss. In Texas, a bill is being proposed that would limit early voting hours, place restrictions on mail-in voting, and increase the frequency of voter list purges. In Iowa, a bill that recently passed would designate voters as inactive for missing a federal election, forcing them to re-register in order to vote in the future. And in Georgia, where Democrats surprised everyone with victories in the presidential and Senate elections, state lawmakers just passed a new voting law known as SB 202.
On March 25th, Governor Brian Kemp signed into law a sweeping Republican-backed election bill that voting rights advocates say would disproportionately hurt Black voters.
So what does the new law mean for voters in Georgia? Fewer days to request a mail-in ballot, and even fewer to return it. And drop boxes exist, but barely.
Most of these new laws center around limiting voting by mail and mandating voter identification requirements. Opponents of these bills say they're targeting low-income voters who have less flexibility to vote during work hours and also are less likely to have a driver's license or other form of ID.
Let me be crystal clear and unequivocal. This legislation is unacceptable. It is a step backwards, and it does not promote principles we have stood for in Georgia.
Republicans both nationally and in Georgia are threatening those companies that have spoken out against the bill with revoking tax breaks and other punitive measures.
Well, the corporations obviously have no idea what they're talking about because many of their objections, it's pretty clear they haven't actually read the bill.
CEOs who have the power, who have capital, who have large employee bases, who pay taxes, need to stand up and make their voice heard.
The aftershocks of a tumultuous 2020 presidential election continue to reverberate as these voting law battles echo throughout the country. After losing the 2020 presidential election to Joe Biden, President Trump repeatedly contested the results through his Twitter feed and other social media accounts. And despite zero evidence of widespread voter fraud, which was even repeated by his Attorney General Bill Barr, his base took his words as truth. That forced Republican lawmakers to make it look like they were tackling this voter fraud problem, even if it didn't exist.
They really are saying that the bill is necessary to ensure election security and promote voter confidence, but this is really kind of based on what we saw during the 2020 election, where former President Donald Trump, was continually spreading these conspiracies about widespread voter fraud associated with mail-in voting and early voting.
And after traditionally Republican Georgia swung to the Democrats in the presidential and Senate elections, the Republican-controlled state legislature crafted a bill to change voting laws. Critics of the bill say that it is a form of voter suppression. Proponents of the bill say that it makes elections more secure and fixes problems that were found during the last election cycle.
There were problems. We had a 351% increase in the number of ballots by mail absentee that we had in our state. That created great problems for our county officials doing an arbitrary signature match.
Georgia, perhaps more than any other state, has benefited financially from the success of the civil rights movement. And so Governor Kemp should not find it surprising that if he wishes to hurl his state back into Jim Crow, that big business, that corporations would withdraw from their involvement in his state.
Are you worried that this new law may lead to some companies and businesses leaving Georgia or deciding not to come there?
So for months, civil rights activists criticized the legislation and its previous iterations, and they called on major corporations headquartered in Georgia to fight against the restrictive voting proposals. In the weeks before the new laws passed, companies like Coca-Cola, Delta, Home Depot, and UPS offered mostly broad statements supporting fair and secure elections and voting rights, but they really didn't take a direct stance on the proposals. And if they were opposing measures in the bill, they weren't doing so publicly.
72 Black executives, including former American Express chairman and CEO Ken Chenault and Merck CEO Ken Frazier, signed an open letter speaking out against the bill.
And that set off a snowball of corporate America really coming out in opposition to some of the laws including some of the same Georgia-based companies that previously stayed mostly silent.
In recent months, we saw the Business Roundtable come out with a new statement on the purchase of a corporation, and part of it was they should support the communities that they're in.
On April 10th, dozens of corporate executives met in an online gathering to debate how to approach the situation.
And it's very clear Delta does not agree with the voter law that was passed in Georgia.
The bill is not just suppression. The bill is silly.
Pro-sports organizations have also weighed in on the new voting law.
I believe, as does everyone in our organization, that the right to vote is fundamental in our democratic society.
And Major League Baseball moved its All-Star game from Georgia to Colorado to protest the new bill.
This isn't just about one game. This is about many, many years. This is about voting rights. This is about the foundation of democracy.
I also think organizations are starting to realize that when they sit in communities where they're not being additive, where they're, having harm, those communities become less stable. People become less likely to buy their products. People are less likely to want to work for them.
Former President Donald Trump lashed out at several of the corporations that spoke out against the new law, calling for a boycott against Coca-Cola, Major League Baseball, Delta Airlines, and others. Prominent Republicans also weighed into the situation.
I found it completely discouraging to find a bunch of corporate CEOs getting in the middle of politics. My advice to the corporate CEOs of America is to stay out of politics. Don't pick sides in these big fights.
Some Republicans lashed out at companies who operate in China, calling their actions in response to the Georgia law hypocritical due to their perceived silence on Chinese human rights abuses.
Coca-Cola is lobbying behind the scenes in Congress against a slave labor bill for China's religious minorities. Or Delta partners with a Chinese Communist Party-owned airline really is the height of moral hypocrisy.
So Delta Airlines are business partners with the Chinese Communist Party, the same Chinese Communist Party that is committing genocide against Uyghur Muslims inside of China.
The spat over Georgia's new voting law could be one more signal of a new dynamic between Republicans and big business. Corporate America and conservatives have traditionally had a similar goal of deregulation, lower taxes, and free trade. That cozy relationship seems to be fraying.
It's really regretful this has become a partisan issue, because I would think that folks, no matter which political party they support, want fair and secure elections. And I think what the critics of the Georgia law are losing sight of is that what you need for fair elections is both access and security.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had a system called pre-clearance, where 9 states needed federal approval to proceed with new voting laws. This system would have likely prevented the new law in Georgia from taking effect. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the pre-clearance system in a 5-4 ruling, effectively gutting the power of the Voting Rights Act. To replace the Voting Rights Act, Democratic lawmakers are continuing to push for H.R. 1, the For the People Act, to pass into law, which would likely curtail the Georgia legislation. Opinions on the new bill are starkly partisan.
It's probably the worst election bill I've ever seen dropped in Congress. It would be a complete federal takeover of the administration of elections, something that's been run by the state since our founding.
This is going to take Joe Manchin really getting in touch with the fact that history has given him a choice. Either Senator Manchin can be the one who aids and abets voter suppression, or Senator Manchin, like Lyndon Baines Johnson before him, can be the one who decides to part ways with those who would suppress the vote.
But to pass, H.R. 1 would have to overcome the 60 votes needed to bypass the filibuster. The fight between Republicans and Democrats over voting rights in Georgia could set the stage for midterm elections and control of Congress in 2022.
And Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has promised that he'll bring For the People Act to the Senate floor for a vote. What really stands in the way for Democrats is the Senate filibuster and the fact that they'll need to have all 50 Democratic votes as well as 10 Republican votes in order to move past the filibuster and bring the legislation to a final vote.